One morning, planes simply disappeared from the skies. It wasn't due to weather conditions. It wasn't an act of war. It was because an entire nation said, "Enough." Airport terminals fell eerily silent. Florida's vibrant resorts went dark. Rental cars in Las Vegas gathered dust. But how did it come to this? It wasn't a sudden trade dispute or a mere political jab. It stemmed from something far more profound. Years of building tension between two countries often considered close allies. Canada had just announced a total boycott of all flights to the United States, and the consequences were more far-reaching than most could have imagined. This story isn't merely about disrupted vacations. It's about influence, economic consequences, and what happens when neighbors turn their backs on each other. Number 6. Tariff retaliation sparked the fire. This crisis didn't begin at the airports or even in the skies. It began with a financial blow, a harsh 25% tariff on Canadian steel and aluminum. The US government labeled it a strategic move. Ottawa saw it as economic sabotage. How does a country respond when its largest trading partner strikes its economy so directly? With fire. And that's exactly what Canada did in early 2025. The government launched a sweeping wave of economic retaliation, and air travel was the first sector to be hit. But this wasn't just about metal. The tariffs ignited widespread public outrage, eroded trust, and escalated into a political standoff that reached into every Canadian household. A staggering 90% of Canadians supported reducing their country's reliance on the US. That's more than a protest. That's a national shift. And the first shockwave didn't strike Washington, it hit the skies. When a neighbor shuts the gate and tosses the key, the results can be seismic. Number 5. Collapse at the border and in the skies. The fallout didn't happen overnight. Airports didn't instantly become ghost towns, and highways didn't go quiet with a single statement. But the warning signs were there, if you knew where to look. First, one flight was cancelled. Then another. Suddenly, travelers bound for Florida were scrambling, while rental cars in Buffalo remained untouched. By March 2025, the decline was impossible to ignore. Flights between Canada and the US had plummeted by more than 70%. But here's what no one anticipated. This wasn't just a travel disruption. It was a rupture in the daily rhythm of millions of lives. What do you do when the family vacation you've taken for 10 straight years vanishes? When weekend cross-border shopping trips are no longer viable? When attending a business conference across the border becomes a logistical nightmare? That's the reality Canadians faced. Before we dive deeper, take a second to subscribe to our channel. That's how we continue to bring you deeply researched, revealing stories that go far beyond the headlines. It helps more than you might realize. And what comes next will make you question how secure our travel systems truly are. So, why did this mass vanishing of travel occur? It wasn't about safety. It wasn't about high fuel prices. It was about something far more volatile: national outrage and political retaliation. Following the US's imposition of severe tariffs on Canadian exports, particularly steel and aluminum, Canada struck back in a bold, historic way, by boycotting American travel altogether. The public reaction was explosive. Canadians weren't just canceling their trips, they were demanding the government take a stand. A February 2025 poll revealed that more than 90% of Canadians supported cutting back ties with the United States. In response, airlines like Air Canada and WestJet slashed their US routes, while travel agencies reported a staggering 40% drop in bookings to American destinations. Almost overnight, border traffic collapsed. By February, the number of Canadians driving into the US had declined by nearly 25% compared to the previous year. That's not a temporary dip, it's a freeze in daily cross-border movement. Entire industries began to feel the pressure. Travel agencies that once specialized in trips to Disney or shopping sprees in New York saw business come to a halt. Buses to US outlet malls remained parked. And in towns like Windsor, Sarnia, and Vancouver, where border travel is woven into daily life, the streets grew quieter. But here's what most missed: this shift wasn't just about tourism. It sent shockwaves through real estate, retail, and employment sectors as well. Vacation homes in Florida, owned by Canadian retirees, commonly known as snowbirds, started flooding the market. One realtor in Fort Lauderdale reported 35 listings from Canadian sellers desperate to get out, with not a single new buyer from Canada stepping in. Meanwhile, American cities heavily dependent on Canadian visitors, like Las Vegas, Orlando, and even Seattle, began preparing for steep economic shortfalls. The U.S. Travel Association warned that even a modest 10% drop in Canadian tourism could cost the U.S. economy billions. Now imagine a collapse of 70% or more. And the trend shows no signs of reversing. That's because the issue has grown beyond tariffs. It's about national pride, protest, and a collective feeling that the situation has gone too far to return to normal. So here's the big question. What happens when one of the world's closest travel partnerships shatters? And more importantly, what if it never comes back? Stay with us. The next chapter reveals just how deep the damage goes. Number 4. U.S. tourism revenue nosedives. Picture this. Palm trees swaying, hotel pools packed, tour buses crowding casino entrances. That used to be the norm. Then one country pulled the plug. Now, beaches are half empty. Restaurants shut their doors early. And business owners in tourism-dependent states are asking a terrifying question. Where did everyone go? Here's the answer they're afraid to hear. Canada left. After Canada's sweeping boycott of all non-essential travel to the US in early 2025, Canadian tourists vanished from American cities in record numbers. The silence they left behind is now costing billions. Before we show you just how severe the damage is, hit that subscribe button. It helps us continue to bring you the stories that matter, rich with data, analysis, and the kind of insight mainstream headlines often miss. Now, let's start with Florida, the Sunshine State and a favorite destination for Canadian snowbirds. In 2024, over 3 million Canadians visited Florida, spending hundreds of millions on hotels, golf outings, entertainment, and of course, Disney. But by spring 2025, the tourism boom had turned into a bust. One travel agency in Quebec reported a 60% drop in bookings to Florida by March. Car rentals dried up. Condo rentals disappeared. Even Florida's theme parks, usually immune to economic downturns, started to feel the freeze from the north. Las Vegas told a similar story. The city, built on tourism from international visitors, especially Canadians, noticed entire blocks of hotel rooms sitting empty. Bachelor parties, weekend getaways, and group bookings disappeared. And the numbers? They're not just alarming, they're staggering. The U.S. Travel Association estimated that a 10% decline in Canadian visitors could cost the American economy over $2 billion. But with actual declines between 70% and 75%, the damage may exceed $4 billion in lost revenue by the end of 2025. Jobs are now at serious risk. Hotels in Florida and Nevada are cutting employee hours. Tourism operators in New York and California are trimming staff. Airlines dependent on cross-border routes are scaling back operations. Ground transportation companies, especially in cities like Buffalo, Detroit, and Seattle, are seeing a sharp drop in passengers. But the impact runs even deeper. In states like Arizona, small towns catering to Canadian retirees, those same snowbirds, are spiraling. Real estate agents report dozens of properties being listed by Canadians eager to return home. Canadian dollars are no longer flowing into golf resorts, pharmacies, or even local diners. In theory, yes. But in practice, it's not that simple. Canadian tourists are uniquely consistent. They're not just summer vacationers, they arrive year-round. They spend weeks, sometimes months, especially in places like Florida, Arizona, and California. They rent homes, buy groceries, visit clinics, and even enroll their kids in local programs. That kind of extended stay and deep integration simply isn't replicated by most tourists. And that's why the sudden disappearance of Canadian travelers is not just a tourism dip, it's a full-blown economic shock. Number 3. Canadian pride becomes policy. This isn't just about economics, it's about identity. What began as public outrage soon turned into political will. By mid-2025, the Canadian government wasn't just encouraging reduced travel to the US. It was actively shaping policy around it. Incentives were introduced for domestic tourism, funding increased for internal airlines, and new trade agreements were fast-tracked with Europe and Asia. The message was clear. Canada was rethinking its dependency on its southern neighbor. Even educational institutions got involved. Schools began offering alternative language programs focusing on French, Mandarin, and Spanish instead of English with an American cultural focus. Media outlets shifted their coverage, prioritizing European and Asian markets over US headlines. Canadian pride had found a new direction, one where reliance on the US was seen as risky, not strategic. Number 2. The business world hits turbulent. Travel wasn't the only casualty. Cross-border business began to feel the squeeze. Executives who once flew between Toronto and New York for lunch meetings were now turning to Zoom. Trade shows in Chicago or Los Angeles saw fewer Canadian participants. Even small-scale importers who relied on weekly border trips faced disruptions that forced them to rethink their operations or shut down entirely. And for the thousands of workers employed in sectors that depend on seamless US-Canada movement, think logistics, hospitality, aviation, job stability vanished overnight. By July 2025, unemployment had risen in key Canadian sectors related to travel and trade, not because of a lack of demand, but because the systems they once depended on were no longer reliable. In the US, too, the pain was felt. Restaurants near Niagara Falls laid off staff. Retail outlets near Detroit slashed hours. And entire industries, from duty-free shops to guided tour companies, found themselves staring into the abyss. Number 1. A new world map of travel and trust. So, where do we go from here? This wasn't just a blip or a tantrum. This was a tectonic shift, a deep rupture in one of the world's most stable relationships. One morning, the planes stopped. But what followed was bigger. A slow unraveling of trust, a re-evaluation of dependency, and the birth of a new travel map. Countries like Mexico, Portugal, and South Korea suddenly saw Canadian travel rise sharply. Cruises to Alaska and Hawaii were replaced with trips to Iceland and Japan. New air routes were launched, not to Miami or Vegas, but to Dubai, Berlin, and even Nairobi. Canada didn't isolate itself. It reoriented. And in doing so, it revealed a hard truth. Alliances, even the closest ones, can crack when tested. What started with a 25% tariff ended with a 70% collapse in travel, billions lost in revenue, and two neighbors now eyeing each other through a very different lens. The planes may fly again. The borders may open. But something fundamental has shifted. And that, perhaps, is the real story. And there you have it. 10 globe-shaking trips that changed more than just itineraries. From policy shifts to economic shocks, these journeys weren't just about getting from point A to point B. They reshaped how we travel, who we trust, and what the future of global movement looks like. If you found this eye-opening, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell, because the next trip around the world might just start with a single headline. Where will the next global shift take us? Stick with us and find out. Until then, travel smart, stay informed, and keep your passport and your mind ready.